Hello guys, it's time for another video lesson and as before we're going to start with a listening question. So make sure you have the Edmodo quiz open as well as the playlist. Because I keep getting in trouble with AudioMac, I've uploaded the playlist to OneDrive and hopefully it will work okay, but you might have to be a little bit patient with the loading times. The other thing to say is it is important when you start the quiz to complete it in one go, because if you go off and do something else, it will time out after a while and then it will automatically send it to me. And quite honestly, some of you have already found out, if I have only got a few complete answers on the quiz, I will reject it and ask you to complete it again. Okay, all right, so we're going to get started. You're going to use track 1 on the playlist and answer questions 1 to 8 on Edmodo. Pause the video now whilst you're doing this. So hopefully you've already done that. There's now a very simple vocab matching task, which is question 9 on Edmodo. So again, pause the video and do that now. Right, so we're going to delve into our focus of the lesson today. What I'd like you to do is listen to track 2 on the playlist and answer question 10. Again, pause the video whilst you do it. Maybe think about these things in order to help you answer this question, but pause the video now. Right, hopefully you got it right. We are in India and, well, from the lesson title, it was a 50-50 chance. Make sure you're making notes on Indian music, as this will be useful for your revision. We won't be doing this in the same detail necessarily in class again. So I want you to think about the piece that you just listened to, track 2. Can you work out how many different layers that there are in the piece? This is important to the musical culture. There's no question on Edmodo, I just want you to have a think. So if you'd like, maybe pause the video and have a listen again, otherwise carry on. In the piece that we have listened to, track 2, there's a melody layer, there's a rhythm or percussion layer, and there's a drone layer. And you can see that actually the melody and percussion layer have 2 special names. These are important. So the rag or raga, so sometimes spelt with an A after the G and sometimes without the A. Actually, there's multiple spellings. This is like your scale. So it's like saying you're in a rag of C major, which isn't a rag, but it's the set of pitches that you use, a type of mode, okay? And this is something that you do need to know. The tal is sort of like your time signature, but it's more accurately often referred to as a rhythmic cycle, okay? And the reason for that is because you don't just have the same number of beats repeating. So for example, we used to the time signature 4/4, where we have 4, then 4, then 4, etc. A tal, you might have a sort of bar, if you like, of 3, then a bar of 4, then a bar of 3, then a bar of 4. And that might be your pattern that you then repeat. And there are various different combinations. So that's your tal. And then obviously the drone is a note which is held or sustained for a long time, or indeed the same note is repeated throughout. Our rag layer, in this example, track 2, was played by the sitar. Now, arguably, the sitar is probably the most recognisably Indian musical instrument, and it has quite a distinctive long neck. And as well as the strings that you pluck when you play, there's another set of strings behind those, and when you pluck the main strings, those other strings vibrate. These are called sympathetic strings. That's strings that vibrate without you touching them. And that's what creates the shimmery effect. The rhythmic instrument, the percussion instrument that we heard was the tabla. We actually have a set of these at school. So when we have time, we'll actually have a look at these. And if you want to have a go, you can certainly have a go. Really good tabla players make the instrument sounding absolutely incredible. I sound terrible when I play them. But one interesting thing about them is one of them is actually made out of metal and one of them has a wooden frame. So you get this nice, interesting timbre in a set of tabla. And also the skin is very flexible, and so performers are able to manipulate the pitch. The last instrument that we heard was the tambura, and this is our drone instrument. So essentially, the tambura player just plays one note throughout the whole piece. So actually, if you want to get started as an Indian classical performer, maybe you start with a tambura. So these are three instruments that you need to know. Make sure you've got a note of those. I've got maybe the two most important that come up a lot are the sitar and tabla on there. Haven't included the tambura. But the bansuri and sarangi are instruments which you're also expected to know for IGCSE music. It's really important that not only you know the name of the instrument, but you recognise how the instrument is played. So obviously the tabla is struck or hit. The bansuri is blown because it's a type of flute. The sitar we've already said is plucked, and people sometimes confuse it with the sarangi because obviously it's a string instrument, but the sarangi is bowed. Okay, so that's the main difference between the sitar and the sarangi, and these are both melody instruments along with the bansuri. So make sure you've got those down and noted how these instruments are played. A little bit of context for you, and it would be useful to make some notes. But again, you're not necessarily going to need to know huge amounts of detail at this stage, other than the fact that the tradition itself is very, very old. It dates back to before 1700 BC, and it is still performed today in its authentic form. One famous performer that you may have heard of is Ravi Shankar, who probably became famous in the West through his work with the Beatles. He's also, funnily enough, the father of Norah Jones, who's quite a popular kind of pop jazz singer. Now, this tradition is what we call an oral tradition, which is similar to sub-Saharan African music in its traditional form. But it's quite an intense commitment from the student. Quite often the student lives with the guru or the teacher, and they even take on other responsibilities and chores whilst they're studying with them. And in terms of its performance context, traditionally it was arguably reserved for the rich and wealthy, and it was heard in formal places such as courts and temples. And actually, to sort of now, it's obviously become more and more accessible. But some would argue that it's not necessarily consumed by the public as the sort of most important or most popular type of music, as obviously things have moved on. There is still quite a big industry, tourist industry for this music, and we hear it in concert halls, on TV, on radio, etc. The structure of this music is quite important, and there are some commonalities in most examples of music from this tradition. The two important sections that you should know are the alap and the gat. Okay, now the alap is an introductory section which uses the rag, so the scale that it's in, and it introduces that scale. So it kind of, there's an improvisation which sort of plays up and down the scale. There's no meter, there's no sense of pulse, there's no percussion instrument. And the gat is a pre-composed section, so it's not an improvisation, and it has a percussion instrument in it, so potentially the tabla. There are other sections, such as the jaw, where there is a sense of pulse but no percussion instrument, and the jala, which is after the gat, and it just basically gets more and more dramatic, builds towards a climax, and quite often the performers get quite virtuosic. The tabla player, for example, might play very complex rhythmic patterns. This is typical for an instrumental piece. For a vocal piece, it's essentially the same. The only difference is we don't have a gat, we have something called a bandish, which annoyingly or conveniently is exactly the same. It's just for a voice, not for a melody instrument. Okay, so some key features that we've basically already discussed are that we have both improvised and composed sections. So the alap is a good example of an improvised section, the gat or bandish, a composed section. There are three clear layers to the music, the melody, percussion and drone layers. And another thing is that we often have lots of decoration in terms of pitch bends and other ornamentation. It's also obviously important that you know the names of the instruments that I've referred to. Don't get bogged down if you do other research. There are lots of other instruments that could be heard in an extract, but you wouldn't be expected to name them. What I've done is I've then sort of summarised this in the same way that I have in other lessons. So do pause the video and make sure you get these down. These are exam answers which have been accepted across different exams. Again, a pinch of salt is needed here because you might have a section of music where there is no tabla playing. So you might have an alap, for example. So use your ears. That's always the number one rule. But get these down, pause the video before we move on. Okay, assuming that you've done that, I've got an exam question for you now. So you need to answer questions 12 to 17 on Edmodo. Before you do that, there is another question, so question 11. And simply what you need to do is match the instrument with how it's played before you go on to these questions, okay? So pause the video and essentially you're answering question 11 and then question 12 to 17 using track 3. Right, hopefully you've done that. Oops, those are the questions there. We're going to move on now and you should be able to guess this straight away. But you're going to use the next track, so track 4 on Edmodo, in order to decide where we are in the world. And if you didn't get it, you should have done. This is Indonesian music, okay? And this style of music is distinctive and very different from Indian music. So make sure you've got separate notes here. The most important word here is gamelan, okay? Gamelan is essentially the type of ensemble which is often heard in Indonesian music. Luckily, you don't need to name any other instruments other than gamelan, which is actually the word for the type of orchestra heard in this music. So the piece that we listened to has got this title. I'm not going to read it because I can't say that my Balinese pronunciation is very good. But interesting, the word means to strike and ostinato. Now, these are two, you might guess, important features of the music. Now I've got 2 questions for you there. I just thought it'd be interesting to know whether you do this, but I doubt you're going to sit and sing. But one thing is to think about the number of notes that you hear in the melody. So go back and have a go at doing that. There's no question on Edmodo. And you may have heard that there's 4 significant notes, but actually there are 5 in total, which is obviously a pentatonic scale. Now, again, in terms of the instruments that make up the gamelan, you don't need to know the ins and outs. You don't need to know every single instrument. But it is important to think about the timbre, so the quality of the sound and like how it's played. The 3 categories of instruments that we tend to hear are gongs, metallophones, and drums. Now, if you want to know, the special names of the metallophones are the sarong and the drums are the kendang, but you don't need to answer that in the exam. You could do, but it's not an expectation, okay? Just to show you, there's a diagram there. We've got some gongs at the back, some sarong on the floor, sort of in the middle, and some kendang to the right of that. So this is also a picture of a typical gamelan setup. Some key features of gamelan. First is about respect. So traditionally, these instruments are believed to have spiritual powers, and you're actually not even allowed to wear shoes out of respect for these instruments. You will, if you ever go to Indonesia, for example, Bali, you are likely to come into contact with this kind of music somewhere. I've been to Bali a few times, and actually I found pretty much everywhere I've gone, I've somehow stumbled upon a gamelan. And whilst traditionally this music was used for rituals and ceremonies, it's often used for celebrations and formal events as well. Now, you might be interested to know that traditionally it was only boys and men that were allowed to play this music, but things have moved on However, there is still a rule that you're not supposed to have mixed gender ensembles, but at least things have moved on so that ladies are able to play too. So some key features. One is to do with the tuning. So there are some special words here, slender and pelog. You don't need to use those in the exam, but quite often we have a slendro or a 5-note pentatonic scale. In the performance, you don't actually have a conductor, so I would be even more useless than I normally am. But the drummers actually help to lead the ensemble and keep everyone together. It's structured around cycles of sections, but two important terms to think about are that it's heterophonic in texture quite often. So whilst it's not always heterophonic, if you start to hear lots of people playing and in an exam it asks you to comment on the texture at that point, it's likely to be heterophonic. And again, as I've said, we have this cyclic pattern. So just some key features for you here as we've got in the other example. So heterophonic texture, use of ostinatos, pentatonic scale, use of metallic instruments, and contrasting dynamics. Now, again, you can choose to memorize some of the other vocab, but I've just slimmed this down to what is absolutely essential for the exam. Okay, so pause the video, get your notes down before we move on. And here it is, your exam question. So you can answer the remaining questions on Edmodo. This is using the last track in the playlist, track 5. So pause the video to do this. But if you have any questions after you've submitted the quiz, please do send me a message. Okay guys, thank you very much.